All right, so picture this. You're a contractor, you're wrapping up this huge project, everything's going great, you're feeling good. Then like a year later, bam, a lawsuit.
Oh, no.
Yeah, right? Turns out there's this like hidden problem with the work you did,
Yeah.
and now you're scaring down this like massive claim.
Yeah, I can see how that would be like a contractor's worst nightmare.
Totally. And it's actually why Commercial General Liability insurance exists. CGL.
Right. CGL. Yeah.
So today we are doing a deep dive into CGL, specifically for contractors. We're going through this Central Insurance blog post, and get this, they actually have commentary from an underwriter. So we're getting the straight story, no fluff.
Oh, wow. Straight from the horse's mouth. That's great. Especially with insurance. It can be so, well, complicated.
For sure. Okay, so
So,
most contractors, they know that CGL covers, like, claims from other people. But this blog post, it goes deep into some really specific stuff.
oh, interesting.
Yeah, like they talk about this thing called fire legal liability coverage.
Hmm.
What happens, if you're working in a space you're renting and accidentally, like there's an electrical fire and it damages the building. Whoops.
Oh, yikes. Yeah, that's where fire legal liability would be a lifesaver. It's kind of an exception in CGL because it's usually about protecting you from someone else's claim, not covering damage that happened to a property that, well, you own.
Right.
But in this case, like, it gets that you're working in a place you don't actually own, and it helps to cover those repair costs.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's like an extra shield, especially for those specific situations.
Right.
So, a lot of contractors are probably thinking, okay, CGL, that covers the basic stuff. But what about, the weird risks of my specific trade?
Yeah, good point.
And that's where this gets interesting because the blog post talks about how you can customize CGL, like with endorsements and stuff.
Ah, I see.
And one that I saw, I was like, what
Hmm.
is the blanket additional insured endorsement?
Oh, yeah.
Can you, like, explain what that is?
Yeah, so in construction, you're often required, like in a contract, to add other people, like the project owner or the general contractor, as additional insureds on your policy. A blanket additional insured endorsement makes that way easier. Instead of listing everybody by name, it just covers a whole group, which
Hmm.
is, simpler, and you could save money on those administrative fees.
So it's like
Yeah.
less paperwork and less hassle.
Exactly. It's about making sure the coverage is really good and easy to manage.
Yeah, I think every contractor out there likes the sound of that.
Absolutely.
Now, there's another option they mentioned, and I was like, whoa, it's called per project aggregates. What are those about?
So this is where you can get really smart with how your coverage works. So instead of having this one big liability limit for your whole policy, per project aggregates let you set a separate limit for each job.
Okay.
So imagine one project has this big claim against it. With per project aggregates, that claim doesn't wipe out all the coverage you have for your other projects that are still going on.
Wow. So it's like having different insurance buckets for each project.
Exactly.
And that could actually save a contractor tons of money because they can match the coverage to the risk of each project, right?
Exactly. It's a really strategic way to manage, how much risk you're exposed to, especially if you've got lots of projects going on that all have different levels of risk.
Right. So CGL sounds like pretty awesome,
Mhm.
but it's not some magical solution for every problem.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
And the blog post is pretty honest about what CGL doesn't cover. And I think that's important to talk about.
Yeah, absolutely. Knowing what your policy doesn't cover, that's just as important as knowing what does cover. No one wants any bad surprises later on.
Right. Okay, so let's talk about these exclusions. First up, what if you, like, damage your own equipment? Like, you back your truck into your table saw.
Oh, no.
Is that covered under CGL?
Sadly, no. That would be considered what we call first-party property damage. And CGL is really focused on, like, liability to other people. You'd need a separate commercial property policy if you want coverage for damage to your own stuff.
Gotcha. So that's something to remember. What about situations where, like, there's pollution involved? I feel like that's super relevant for contractors, especially those working with, like, maybe dangerous materials.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, your typical CGL policy, it often excludes pollution-related claims. So say you have a chemical spill and it contaminates the soil or even the water. Those cleanup costs, not covered. You'd need a specific pollution liability policy for that.
Okay. So speaking of specialized coverage, the blog post mentioned something called an exclusion for professional services liability. When does that come up for contractors?
So that applies to contractors who also do design work as part of their job, the design build folks. If there's a problem with their design and it leads to damage, A normal CGL policy wouldn't cover that.
I see.
They'd need what we call errors and omissions coverage, or sometimes it's called professional liability insurance, to protect them from those kinds of claims.
So it's like they need an extra layer of protection specifically for their design work on top of the general liability coverage.
Precisely. And that's where working with a good insurance agent is so important. Someone who knows their stuff. They can help you spot those gaps in your coverage based on what you do and then suggest, like, the right endorsements or even other policies to fill those gaps.
So important. Okay, now here's an exclusion I think every single contractor needs to know about. Employee injuries. What's the deal there?
Oh, yeah. This one's a common misunderstanding.
Yeah.
CGL, it doesn't cover injuries to your employees. That's what workers' compensation insurance is for.
Right.
It's mandatory in most states, and it covers things like medical expenses and lost wages for employees who get injured on the job.
So if, like, an employee falls off scaffolding and they need medical attention,
Yeah.
that's workers' comp, not CGL.
Exactly. Remember, CGL is all about protecting you from claims made by other people, not your own employees.
Got it. All right, we've covered a lot, but there's one more exclusion I want to hit before we move on. The dreaded completed operations exclusion.
Oh, yes.
This one seems tricky.
Yeah, it can be. So basically, if a problem pops up with your work after you've finished a project, let's say some bad craftsmanship that leads to damage way down the line, a standard CGL policy might not cover those claims.
Wait, so even if I have CGL, I could still be held responsible for bad work years later?
Yeah, that's the risk with the completed operations exclusion. But don't worry, there's a way to handle it. You can add what's called a completed operations endorsement to your policy, and that extends your coverage to include claims that pop up from work you've already finished. It gives you that extra peace of mind.
So it's like a safety net for those problems that can, like, sneak up on you later.
Precisely. And again, having a good insurance agent, that's key. They can explain these complicated exclusions and make sure you have the right endorsements to protect your business.
That's so helpful. Okay, so it's clear that CGL is really important for any contractor, but it's not something you can just, like, set up and forget about.
No, not at all.
You need to be proactive, really understand the details, customize your coverage, and work with an agent who knows what they're talking about to make sure you're fully protected.
Couldn't agree more. It's all about being informed and making smart choices for your business.
For sure.
It makes me think about all the different types of contractors out there. We talked about Central Insurance having special programs for like home builders and artisan contractors, but what about all the other like unique construction niches, like demolition contractors or road builders or even underwater welders?
Oh, yeah.
Like the list goes on and on. It just shows how important it is to really get down to the nitty-gritty and figure out the specific risks of your particular trade.
That's such a good point. Like, what other specialized endorsements or policies might be out there that are a perfect fit for your type of work? The more you know, the better you can protect your business.
Right? Absolutely. Knowledge is power, especially in the world of insurance.
Totally. And on that note, we'll wrap things up for now. But keep learning, keep those insurance policies in great shape, and we'll catch you next time. So we're diving deeper into this whole CGL thing for contractors.
Yeah.
And in that Central Insurance blog post, something that stood out to me was how they really stressed tailoring those policies for different types of contractors.
Oh, right.
Like they even have these like specific programs for home builders and artisan contractors.
Yeah, it makes sense if you think about it, right? I mean, a small electrical contractor, they're not facing the same risks as a company that's building like skyscrapers.
Right. Totally different ballgame.
So having an insurance company that gets those differences, that's a big deal.
Huge. So let's get specific. What makes these like specialized programs different?
Well, take their program for home builders. It's called Home Builders Plus Coverage. And it's designed around, all the unique risks of residential construction. They even like factor in local building codes and regulations, which, as you know, can be a real headache.
It's a minefield out there. So they've done the research and taken those regional differences into account.
Exactly. Saves you a lot of trouble later on. And remember those endorsements we talked about, like the blanket additional insureds and per project aggregate?
Oh, yeah.
Those are already baked into these programs, so it's like a more complete approach.
Oh, interesting. So it's not just like tacking them on as extras. It's like part of the whole deal.
Exactly. And for those artisan contractors, they often work with like really unique materials and techniques.
Right.
Central has a similar approach. It's recognizing that a one-size-fits-all policy just doesn't work in construction.
It makes me realize that picking the right CGL policy, it's like way more than just comparing prices.
It's 100% about finding a partner that really understands your business, like
Hmm.
inside and out.
Yeah. And the blog post, it really emphasized the role of those independent insurance agents.
Hmm.
Why are they so important?
I think of them as like your insurance guides.
Hmm.
They help you navigate all those different coverage options and they explain things in a way that makes sense.
Yeah.
And they make sure you're not, you know, paying too much for coverage you don't actually need, or even worse, missing something super important.
Right. So they bridge that gap between the construction world and the insurance world.
Precisely. And the blog post mentioned something I wanted to ask you about, Central's financial strength rating. What does that even mean?
Honestly, I'm a little fuzzy on that myself.
Okay, well, think of it like a credit score, but for insurance companies.
Yeah.
So independent agencies, they assess how financially healthy and stable the company is. It basically tells you, how likely they are to actually pay out if you have to make a claim.
So it's a measure of how reliable they are.
Exactly. You don't want to have a policy with a company that might not be able to pay if you have a big claim, right?
Right. That's not a good situation.
Nope. And Central, they have an A rating from AM Best, which is considered excellent.
Wow. Excellent.
So they're in really good shape financially, which is, reassuring, especially since the blog post mentioned that some insurance companies are having a hard time keeping their ratings up these days.
That's a good point. It's good to know that your insurance company is, strong and stable.
It's all about that peace of mind, knowing you have a safety net that you can really rely on.
Okay, so we've talked about tailored coverage, the role of agents, and financial strength.
Hmm.
What else should contractors keep in mind when they're choosing a CGL policy?
I think we have to remember those exclusions. That's another area where a really experienced agent can be a huge help.
Oh yeah, the what's not covered part.
Right. They can really help you figure out if there are any gaps in coverage based on the kind of work you do.
So let's say you're a contractor and you specialize in I don't know, installing solar panels.
Yeah.
Are there specific endorsements they might suggest?
Yeah, that's a great example. I mean, installing solar panels, that involves working at heights, right? And dealing with electrical systems and maybe even hazardous materials.
Right.
So an agent might recommend endorsements for things like height work, electrical work, maybe even pollution liability, just in case there's a spill or some kind of contamination.
So it's about building up those layers of protection,
Yeah,
anticipating those risks and making sure you're covered for everything.
precisely. It's not just buying a generic policy, it's creating a shield that's specifically made for your business.
Yeah, like a custom-made insurance armor. I like that.
Yeah. We've covered so much today. Tailored policies, agents, those exclusions. It's like there's still so much to learn about this CGL insurance.
It feels like we've only just scratched the surface.
Right. But that's what I love about these deep dives. We
Yeah.
really get to peel back the layers and understand this complicated but super important topic.
It's all about being informed and making smart decisions for your business.
Absolutely. And on that note, let's move on to our final thoughts. We'll wrap things up and give you some key takeaways to remember.
All right, so we're back and ready to wrap up our CGL deep dive. I feel like we've gone through everything.
Yeah, we definitely covered a lot,
Hmm.
from the basics all the way to some pretty specific details.
And I think the biggest thing for me is knowing that CGL is so important for contractors. But it's not a one-size-fits-all kind of thing.
Yeah, for sure. You got to know what your policy covers and what it doesn't cover. That's crucial. It's all about making sure you got the right protection for your specific work, and the risks that come with it.
Totally. So let's turn all this knowledge into some advice for our listeners. What are the main things contractors need to remember about CGL insurance?
Well, first off, don't skimp on the coverage. It might seem tempting to go for the cheapest option, but that could really backfire on you if a big claim comes up. Remember, CGL is there to protect your business, your livelihood. So, investing in the right policy, that's important.
It's like that saying, penny wise and pound foolish.
Yeah.
You might save a little money up front, but end up paying way more later if you're not really covered.
Exactly. And second, work with a good independent insurance agent, someone who specializes in construction. They can be so helpful, guiding you through all of the CGL policies, making sure you understand those endorsements, the exclusions, all that fine print.
Yeah, they're like your insurance translator, making sure you're getting the best coverage possible.
Absolutely. And third, don't just buy a policy and forget about it. Look it over regularly, at least once a year. Make sure it still makes sense for how your business is running and the work you're doing. Things change. And your insurance needs to change too.
Like a checkup for your business, making sure everything's still in tip-top shape.
Exactly. And, last but not least, remember that CGL is just one part of the whole picture. Depending on your business, you might need other types of coverage too, like workers' comp, commercial property insurance, maybe even professional liability insurance if you do any design work.
It's about building that whole, insurance portfolio, right? Making sure you're ready for anything.
Exactly. Having a strong safety net no matter what happens. That's the goal.
I think that's a great place to wrap things up. We've learned so much about CGL insurance, and hopefully our listeners feel more confident about making the right choices for their business.
Yeah, and it all comes down to doing your research, understanding your risks, and finding the right insurance partner.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Thanks for joining us on this CGL deep dive, and we'll see you next time.